Imagine this. You're an ordinary person just like everyone else. You have a family, dreams, and a moral compass that tells you what's right and what's wrong. And yet, one day you find yourself standing in a room, given a simple order. In front of you sits a stranger, their hands bound. A man in a lab coat looks at you and calmly says, "Press the button." You hesitate. The person in the chair flinches as a surge of electricity courses through their body. They let out a scream. You look at the authority figure. "Keep going," he insists. "Now pause for a second. What would you do? Would you refuse, walk away, or would you, like so many before you, follow orders step by step until you cross a line you swore you never would?" This is not a scene from a movie. This was real. It's known as the Milgram Experiment, one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever conducted. Ordinary people, teachers, clerks, fathers, mothers, were instructed to administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to a stranger. And here's the horrifying part. 65% of participants obeyed orders until the very end. But that was just an experiment, a controlled setting. What happens when obedience like this plays out in real life? The core idea, the hidden danger in all of us. We like to believe that only bad people commit evil acts, that only the cruel, the heartless, the psychopaths are capable of harming others. But history tells a different story. Take a step back in time to 1944, a quiet town in Europe. A soldier stands gripping his rifle. His hands tremble. In front of him stand civilians, unarmed, terrified, families just like his own back home. He hesitates. Then the command comes, "Do your duty." And so he pulls the trigger. This man was not a monster. He was just like you, just like me. So ask yourself, how does a good person become capable of such horrors? We want to believe that evil is a conscious choice, that people who commit atrocities do so because they are inherently cruel. But what if I told you that, under the right conditions, you could do the same? Because the truth is this. The scariest thing about human nature isn't that evil exists. It's that it exists within all of us. The 5 stages of moral corruption. No one wakes up and decides, "Today I will become a monster." No dictator, no war criminal, no corrupt leader suddenly abandons their morality in a single moment. It happens gradually. A slow, almost invisible descent, one small step at a time. Psychologists call this the corruption cycle. A pattern that has repeated itself throughout history, turning good people into perpetrators of unimaginable cruelty. It follows 5 predictable stages, and the most terrifying part, you won't even realize you're going through them. Stage 1. Moral erosion. The first small step. It always starts with something small, a tiny lie, a harmless betrayal, a small compromise of values. Nothing major, just something that seems necessary in the moment. But here's the trick. Each step lowers the threshold for the next one. Psychologists call this the foot in the door effect. Once you agree to a small unethical act, you are far more likely to comply with a bigger one later. Look at history. The Watergate scandal. It began as a small act of political espionage, just gathering some information. But step by step, it escalated into one of the biggest corruption scandals in US history. The Enron financial fraud. Tiny accounting manipulations that seemed harmless snowballed into one of the largest corporate frauds ever, costing thousands of people their life savings. Now imagine this process, not in business or politics, but in morality itself. A soldier doesn't start by murdering civilians. A dictator doesn't begin by oppressing millions. They start with a small compromise, and over time, what was once unthinkable becomes acceptable. Stage 2. Obedience to authority. The illusion of duty. We like to think we control our own actions, that our morals are unshakable. But history and psychology tell a different story. Under the right conditions, even the kindest people can be led to commit horrific acts. Not because they are evil, but because they were told to. This is the terrifying power of obedience. Take the Milgram Experiment, where ordinary people delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to a stranger simply because an authority figure told them to. Or look at Nazi Germany, where thousands of officers carried out mass executions, later defending themselves with a chilling phrase, "I was just following orders." Or the My Lai massacre in 1968, where US soldiers slaughtered 500 innocent civilians, including children, because their commanding officers ordered them to. Each of these cases proves one thing: obedience is not always loyalty. Sometimes it is the surrendering of morality. And the moment we blindly follow authority without question, we step deeper into the corruption cycle. Stage 3. Group identity. The us versus them trap. Humans are wired for belonging. We crave connection, community, and identity. But there's a dark side to this instinct. Because the moment we divide the world into us and them, morality starts to fade. History's worst atrocities didn't happen because people were inherently evil. They happened because one group was taught to see another as less than human. The Rwandan genocide, where Hutus referred to Tutsis as cockroaches before slaughtering 800,000 of them. Nazi propaganda, where Jews were called rats to justify their mass extermination. Slavery, where entire populations were dehumanized and labeled as property, making cruelty seem justifiable. And before you think, well, that's history, look around you. It's happening right now. Political opponents are no longer just people with different views. They are traitors. Social media outrage turns into cancel culture mobs, destroying lives without trial. Online harassment escalates because behind a screen, people don't seem real. This is the modern face of dehumanization, and it is the gateway to something even worse. Stage 4. Self-justification and moral licensing. The mind's trickery. No one believes they are the villain in their own story. Even history's worst criminals believed they were doing the right thing. Why? Because the human mind is an expert at self-justification. When our actions contradict our morals, we experience cognitive dissonance, a deep discomfort. Instead of admitting we were wrong, our brain takes a shortcut. It rewrites reality. A corrupt politician convinces himself, I deserve this money. I work hard. A war criminal tells himself, I had no choice. It was for the greater good. A social media troll justifies harassment, they deserved it. The moment someone starts saying, I had no choice, they are in dangerous territory. Because once justification begins, it doesn't stop. Stage 5. Dehumanization. The point of no return. There is a moment in every great crime against humanity, a moment when the unthinkable becomes possible. And that moment is dehumanization. This is the final stage, where empathy disappears entirely. At this point, people are no longer seen as human beings. They are targets, enemies, vermin. And history shows what happens next. The Holocaust, 6 million lives taken because their humanity was erased. The Rwandan genocide, neighbors turned into killers because they saw their victims as insects. Modern online hate culture, where harassment turns into real-world violence. Once this stage is reached, there is no moral boundary left to stop cruelty. And that is how good people become monsters. The big twist. This process is happening right now. You may think this is just history, just psychology. But the terrifying truth is this process is happening right now. Not in concentration camps or war zones, but in workplaces, politics, social media, and everyday life. Every time you justify a small unethical act, every time you blindly follow authority without questioning it, every time you fall into the trap of us versus them thinking, you are stepping into the cycle. And if you don't recognize it, you might just become part of it. How to resist the descent. If history has taught us anything, it's this: no one is immune. Every atrocity, every moral failure, every descent into darkness began with ordinary people, just like you. So how do we stop it? How do we resist the forces that have corrupted so many before us? The answer is not simple, but it starts with awareness. Here's how you can break the cycle before it begins. The mirror test. Are you who you think you are? The human mind is a master of self-deception. We justify, we rationalize, we excuse. So here's a simple test. Ask yourself, would I still see myself as good if I were someone else judging me? If you saw someone else cutting corners the way you do, would you call it corruption? If someone else justified harm the way you do, would you call it cruelty? If history looked back at your choices today, would you be proud? This is the mirror test, and it forces you to see yourself without illusions. Because the scariest thing about moral corruption is that most people don't even realize it's happening. Question authority. Never obey blindly. From childhood, we're taught to obey authority. Teachers, bosses, governments. But here's the truth. Power does not make someone right. Every mass atrocity in history was committed by people who told themselves, I was just following orders. So the next time someone tells you to do something that feels wrong, pause. Ask yourself, would I do this if no one were telling me to? Would I still feel like a good person afterward? If history judged this moment, how would it be remembered? Because obedience without morality isn't loyalty, it's surrender. Destroy the us versus them mentality. Empathy is the antidote. Every genocide, every war crime, every act of mass violence starts with one thing: an enemy, a group labeled as different, dangerous, less than human. And the moment we fall into us versus them thinking, morality starts to fade. This is how neighbors turned on each other in Rwanda, how ordinary people justified the Holocaust, how political divisions today are turning into hatred. So ask yourself, am I seeing a person or just a label? Who benefits from this division? What would happen if I truly listened instead of assuming? Because the moment we stop seeing each other as human, we become capable of anything. And history has already shown us where that road leads. Moral courage. Speak up when it's hardest. It's easy to stay silent, to ignore injustice, to avoid conflict. But silence is not neutral, it is complicity. The people who let corruption slide because it's not their problem. The soldiers who looked away because they were just following orders. The bystanders who watched oppression happen and told themselves, "There's nothing I can do." But there is something you can do. You can speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're the only one. Because history does not need more good people who do nothing. It needs people with courage. The final warning and call to action now. You might be thinking, I would never do something like that. But that right there is the most dangerous thought of all. Because the moment you assume you are immune, you stop paying attention, and that's when the descent begins. This cycle, the slow erosion of morality, blind obedience, tribalism, self-justification, and dehumanization, has shaped some of the darkest moments in human history. And it is still happening, right now, in workplaces, in politics, on social media, every time someone justifies harm, every time someone follows orders without question, every time someone chooses silence over courage. And now that you know this, what will you do differently? Because history does not repeat itself. People repeat history, unless we choose to break the cycle.